I had two jobs. One was an ATF agent, the other was selling prohibited items on the dark web in an undercover capacity. So, it would be late at night, early in the morning, over the weekend, and I would be trying to make deals or talk to people about certain illicit activity, which would end up in a criminal complaint and arrest. Hopefully, not everything did, but, this was a great case. Unfortunately, our activity was revealed, and the account that we had to abandon that. But learned a lot, got a lot of criminals off the street. It was very rewarding, and that became teaching 1,000 officers, prosecutors, and even parents about the dangers of the dark web. Absolutely. I mean, web browsers, I think, as you know, are a fascinating subject. I would remember in one of my jobs, I would triage these vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, and it would work. They say, okay, well, make sure you use this in Safari. And I would joke with my coworker and say, who uses Safari? Why don't people use Chrome? The more you help others, you're going to look good because you're ultimately helping the team. So think of it not as I'm trying to outdo somebody, it's I'm trying to make everyone better. And the best leaders that I've seen are the ones that don't take credit for their team's success. They lift their people up, and people understand, hey, they have a good leader that has their back.
From federal agent to cybersecurity leader, our guest today has built a remarkable career spanning law enforcement, intelligence, and corporate security. Clint Kehr has trained over 1,000 officers in dark web investigations and transformed penetration testing in his previous role at Capital One. Now a senior instructor and training architect at Cybrary, he designs security academies that train hundreds of developers annually. Thanks for joining, Clint.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I know that we talked about you being an instructor and architect at Cybrary, but I hear there's other roles that you're working on as well.
Yes. So I've been at Cybrary teaching for about 5 years. And luckily, the course that I made initially, which was a penetration testing course, did well. And they published it on LinkedIn Learning. So that's there. But that needs to be refreshed. So that's something on the horizon. And I also work for a company called Range Force, which is another training provider where I do purple team content. I'm bridging the offensive security side, which is what got me out of law enforcement into cybersecurity. And now I'm moving more into the blue team side. I'm actually a cybersecurity architect at a U.S. financial regulatory agency. So I'm building now instead of destroying, although ethical hackers are really defenders in disguise, or some don't want to admit that. But I think we're all really blue team at the end of the day.
I agree. I think that we're all on the same team, right? We'll talk more about that in a little bit, right? Because at me having run SOCs many times, I think being a CISO, of course, we have lots of security operations centers that we have going on. It's very interesting, the whole purple teaming space and how adversarial it gets internally when the outsiders, the external threats, actually who our adversary really is, right? So let's talk about your background and career journey. I really want to kind of learn about what you did in the federal government training dark web investigations, right? But you started as a federal agent before transitioning into cybersecurity. Tell us about some of your experiences in the ATF and the cyber threats you handled.
Sure. So, initially I was a normal field agent. So I did warrants, arrest warrants, search warrants, big investigations, some very interesting ones. But an announcement came out one day it was called the Cyber and Intelligence Branch, which eventually got renamed. But I'm like, this is really cool. We're doing cyber now. And I was in intelligence in the Navy Reserve. And I thought it was a great way to get involved in something that I really was passionate about. And about my second week at headquarters in this branch, I was asked to basically do operational work on the dark web, which was fascinating work. There's some great stories. A lot, all these cases have been adjudicated because they're probably a decade or more old. But, this is the time right after Silk Road. And, that had been taken down and new marketplaces had popped up, and things like Bitcoin really weren't too well known about law enforcement, or from the law enforcement standpoint. Tools like Chainalysis were relatively new, and it was a pretty new space to get involved in. And we actually went out to Europol and taught at Europol about dark web investigations, and that was fascinating to teach them about it. And really, I had two jobs. One was an ATF agent, the other was selling prohibited items on the dark web in an undercover capacity. So, it would be late at night, early in the morning, over the weekend, and I would be trying to make deals or talk to people about certain illicit activity, which eventually would end up in a criminal complaint and arrest. Hopefully, not everything did, but this was a great case. Unfortunately, our activity was revealed, and the account that we had to abandon that. But learned a lot, got a lot of criminals off the street, and it was very rewarding. And that became teaching 1,000 officers, prosecutors, and even parents about the dangers of the dark web.
Yeah, I think that the dark web, it's so weird. So, I mean, if you had to guess, right? Most people go to Google, they do searches, and they get to content. I guess that's what we call the not dark web. Is most of the web dark, or is most of the web light? How do you feel about it? Because it's kind of hard. It's hard navigating the dark web because there's just very little, search engine kind of capabilities on it, right? So
the dark web has really evolved. Again, iterations of the dark web, from Silk Road to Alpha Bay, to what there is now. And really, the dark web has gotten saturated with not only law enforcement, but also researchers, right? Or academia. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and one of my projects with an independent project with a professor there was on the dark web, and they had done some research scraping the dark web. And now marketplaces are savvy to this, and they've gotten a lot more resilient when it comes to bots and things like that. Mm-hmm. So you really need humans to kind of go out there and collect intelligence, or you need to be really good at, your program acting as if it's a human, just because there's so many safeguards in place. If you want to get on a marketplace now, there's 7 different puzzles that you have to solve as a person to actually get onto that marketplace. And I'm out of law enforcement now, but I would imagine it's quite frustrating to even log in and to purchase things. But that's the kind of the cat and mouse game of law enforcement. And the criminal element is, this kind of war of attrition. As even us tracing Bitcoin back in the day, it would go direct from a Bitcoin wallet, and something like like Coinbase is a big one, and then it would go into the marketplace. Now they use mixers and things like that to obfuscate these transactions. So I'm not really savvy on what law enforcement is doing now on the dark web, but I imagine there's this evolution of identifying criminals, or trying to track them and trying to catch them. And I think the question we always had was, is it more worth catching the vendors, or is it more worth catching the admins? If you catch a vendor, you cut off that vendor from selling illicit items. If you catch the admin, the whole marketplace goes down. If you look at vendors nowadays, you look at all the different marketplaces they've been in and all their street cred, basically, because really reviews, much as like Amazon, reviews really dictate if somebody's a legitimate vendor or not.
Yeah. I mean, I often wonder, with respect to law enforcement, which is worse, the buying side or the selling side? I mean, I guess they're both bad, but which do you focus on? It seems like if you focus on the vendors, you take more buyers up, but then the buyers are going to just find another vendor. I mean, it's just very much like you said, kind of a cat and mouse game. It's very interesting to me, having been a purchaser of, threat intelligence services that skim the dark web and pull information back and tell me that I'm being targeted and those kinds of things. That's, good for, enterprise security teams. I've had law enforcement call me up and say, "Hey, we found your data online, whatever. What are you going to do about it, John?" I've also had people extort me, like people tell me, "I have your data,"
right.
And those kinds of things. So it's interesting. Every once in a while, I get on tour and I kind of look around and see what's happening. And I find it's like, you really need to be persistent to kind of learn anything about the dark web today. Just kind of like what you're saying. It's like, you just really have to we really need to want something to kind of figure out how to get there, go to the places to find information. It's like a breadcrumbs in the dark forest of Well, let's think about Hansel and Gretel,
Sure.
in
Yeah.
a lot of ways, right? But anyways, well, let's kind of pivot a little bit and tell us about you authored the first ever dark web recognition guide for law enforcement personnel. What did you hope for your successors over in the Department of Justice to learn from your legacy?
Sure. So I got out of headquarters and I was in Salt Lake City at the time as an agent, and I ended up having a case out in Idaho. And I was interviewing the suspect, and I took a look at his phone, and he had the Tor browser on his phone, and he started telling me about the dark web marketplaces he was on. And I thought, well, I know about this stuff because that's what I did for a while, but would an officer who pulled somebody over, on the side of the road, understand if they, had a search warrant or probable cause to look at this person's phone? Would they understand what that onion icon meant, or would they understand, what PGP is or what encryption is? And much like they have recognition guides for narcotics or threat intelligence on, what is going on with narcotics. When I was in law enforcement, they had somebody cross the border and someone had hidden themselves as a chair. I thought that was kind of extreme. So I'm like, we need to have something ready for or available for law enforcement so that they can recognize these icons. They can understand, even if if they're doing a search warrant and somebody's computer is unlocked and they can see the Tor browser on somebody's desktop, that they actually know what that is. And it gained a lot of popularity through many law enforcement agencies, FBI, HSI, you name it. I think IRS as well. So that was a pretty cool project that idea kind of cascaded and really did its intended effect, which was to get to as much law enforcement as possible so they could understand what these things are.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. I mean, obviously, the Tor browser being on a phone or on a laptop, that's an interesting one thing that you could be looking at, kind of speaks to tactics, right? TTPs and stuff like that, right? PGP, or, you're looking at their bookmarks and maybe they have Proton Mail or whatever. I'm a little curious about a little bit about the book about what other kind of telltale signs was in the dark web recognition guide, which I think is an incredibly, I don't know if that's the title of it, but it's neat.
Yes. Yeah. I think, it was called the Dark Web Recognition Guide, and perhaps there have been a few iterations of it. But really, it did break it down into, different browsers, different email, encrypted email, encryption, like PGP, using PGP, because if you've been on the dark web, really that's the way to communicate with people, is finding their public key, writing a message, encrypting it, and then only they can read it. So understanding that operational aspects of the dark web is something that most law enforcement wouldn't understand, but somebody who does this often does. I'm trying to remember back, and I don't want to make anything up, but I seem to remember that it came in handy in actually an interview with a suspect on a more high profile case, that they had seen that guide and that they, recognized something and they asked questions that got some type of confession. So, that was a success story in the guide, that it was actually used successfully. And again, I think I left ATF back in 2019. So, over 5 years ago, hopefully it is still paying dividends today.
Yeah, I imagine it is. I mean, I think it's still, being in technology, I think we forget that other people aren't in technology. It's like the people that I hang out with are all technologists. Right. And then, my mom's doing something on her phone, my dad's doing something on his phone. And then I talk to other people, and it's like, and I start to realize that, wow, most of the people that are using phones really don't know. They don't really know that they're using a computer and how it works or anything. It's, kind of like a remote control in some ways to them. But again, I think that there's a lot more ignorance in the world than there about technology and how it works, and even how not dark web websites and marketplaces work versus, and then even in a dark web, and then how people are trying to maintain secrecy and privacy to hide their efforts on the dark web. I don't think most people really think about it. I mean, I think I was talking to someone the other day, and we were talking about, we always think that everything's secure because we have a little icon in the browser, right? And that's not the way it was 20 years ago when most places didn't have SSL certificates, right? And you could just see what was on the wire all the time. And now it's kind of different where, the communication's secure, which makes like law enforcement work harder, right? But it also makes criminals work harder as well, right? So we're kind of getting, I think we're getting better at that. But there is a lot of ignorance, I think, just in general population about security and how technologists work and then how criminals work on the internet. So I think
Absolutely.
Yeah. I definitely think that your dark web recognition guys got to have been paying dividends for a long time, because I don't think most law enforcement people, like I see every day, walking by me, I don't think they have any clue how the computers work. So having something that gives them a tip that says, hey, you see something weird like this, you should maybe ask a couple questions about it. And, it probably will yield dividends.
Yes, John. And you did bring up an interesting topic about encryption, right? Because especially in law enforcement, initially when I started looking at iPhones, I could give a court order and Apple would decrypt data on that phone, and I could look at it. And then Apple took a very strong stance and so we're not going to provide this information to law enforcement anymore. We're going to encrypt everything. So that's a larger topic and probably something we could talk about for hours. But even at an enterprise level, right? Like, do we want to inspect TLS traffic? Do we want to break encryption and take a look at where people are going and what they're doing? Is that a privacy violation? Are we allowing people in our enterprise to go to their patient portal and look at, PHI? Is that okay for us to do? So encryption in and of itself is a very interesting topic for law enforcement and for corporate world as well, for everybody.
Yeah, and in like 1994, I thought encryption was going to be the big thing, right? And I remember getting the first browser, NCSA Mosaic. I was at Apple at the time, and I'm opening this thing up, and I'm looking at the web at the time in 1994. It was not good, like very little out there. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm just going to put that in the trash, empty trash. That's not going anywhere. And I started talking to, working on like S-MIME encryption for mail. And I thought, like, kind of like PGP kind of things. And I really thought that was going to take off, and it really didn't ever take off. And just generally, so we have, like you said, we have encryption. It's like one of the things about like PGP is that if I can protect my private key and you have my public key, then if you're using my public key and you're signing it with your private key, then I know it's coming from you. Right. Or, I have a lot of faith that it's coming from you, right? At least technology wise, it's coming from you. Right. And then people do protect their private keys pretty well, I would say, that are Hopefully. In this kind of, you would think. I've been in many incident responses where developers and engineers leave the private keys locally on the system, right? So they can spin up their web server, and then the hacker gets on the system. Now they have the private key. Now they can decrypt everything that's going on the communications and stuff. So, but it just depends on who you are and what do you think a private key is. If it's just a means to an end to set up a web server, then you're probably not going to take care of it. But if it's you're trying to protect your identity and communications, then you probably will. But I think that we've kind of moved into that privacy space where privacy is more important than. I don't know if it's more important than security. I guess it depends how you define security, I guess, and in a lot of ways, I think of law enforcement as security. And just like in enterprise, it's like, when does security become too much? Right. When it becomes detrimental to, the objectives of a business. On the personal front, when is it that, law enforcement is invading privacy where they shouldn't be? Right. I want to talk to you about Offensive Security Academy that trains developers in security. What did that entail, and how did you make security training engaging for developers?
Absolutely. So, I think that was the biggest thing in getting my passion for offensive security was very focused and very targeted. And I think hackers really have that mindset, like let's get the crown jewels, let's get the treasure. And that's where my focus was. And conversely, with developers, I remember I was giving a course, was with a third-party training platform, was kind of like multiple choice. Like you looked at the code and you said, where is the SQL injection vulnerability? Mm-hmm. And in my mind, it's like, okay, well, let's look at the syntax that looks like a SQL query. Immediately, let me find that. And a developer said, wait, you're going too fast. I need to understand what the application's doing. So that made me think my way of thinking is different than the developer's way of thinking. And I also saw, I think maybe it was on TikTok, but there's this great reel or video where, there's that board when you're a kid and there's the square and the circle and all the different
Triangle.
shapes and you have all the different, yes. And the guy says, okay, well, the circle goes in the circle hole and the square goes in the circle hole. And, this goes in the circle hole and everything fit in the circle hole. And this woman's face is just, she's so exasperated, like, oh my gosh, like, what are you doing? And that's kind of, I think, how a pen tester or a red teamer explains something to a developer, because, this is how the application works for them. This is the happy path. This is how it's supposed to go. And as an attacker, your job is to break everything, and your mindset is different. But what I try to do, one, is to kind of mix both sides, right? We talked about purple teaming a bit, but let's talk about writing secure code and using secure frameworks and libraries by default. But let's also step into the shoes of an attacker, because I think that's fun. So we kind of blended both sides. We blended the secure coding with, okay, this is how you parameterize queries, but also this is what happens if you don't. And this is how you can dump a database and reveal all this type of information. And if you're not, we're talking about encryption, right? You're not hashing or encrypting your database, it's open to attackers. So I remember once there was a vulnerability in one of the companies that I worked for that was an open redirect on a password reset page, and the developers didn't want to fix it. And it had been a long time that they got an exception. It had been a long time that they had not fixed it. So I stood up my own phishing page and said, here's what happens with this open redirect. And this is what happens if you enter your information into my phishing site. And they fixed the vulnerability right then and there and identified other websites that had that same vulnerability, that open redirect, because they saw the impact. And I think, as someone in cybersecurity, talking to developers, it's really showing them, and leadership, right? It's really showing them what the impact is. It's easy to tell you something, but unless you see it or you do it, and that was the focus of the academy, was look how bad this can be.
Yeah, I've used the happy path analogy so many times because, the mindset of a developer is feature, make it work, right? And once it's working, it works, right? The code has problems, that's optimization, right? I think this is the kind of mindset of a developer, and which is good. This is what we want from business. We want features being developed. This is what we want. And I think the conversation I have with developers many times has been, why would anyone do that? Right? It's like okay, so right. It's like, no, they're just supposed to log in. Right? That's all they're supposed to do. And then they go and they get access to the database. Why would someone try to use this open redirect, right? Or why would they try to do this? And I think that's one of the hurdles with developers, is that they designed a happy path. They're trying to give a legitimate user access to a feature or a capability with the least amount of friction as they can, so that the legitimate user can have joy, right? I think, this is great. We'd love that. I think that's the first hurdle, is the why would anyone do that? And, in a lot of ways, it's like, why do hackers do these things, right? Sometimes it could be criminal intent. Sometimes it's just, researchers being curious, right? Not everyone that's a hacker is, malicious, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Why they do it, who knows? Just people are just wired differently, right? What's interesting about it is kind of going into it, like you said, it's like you got to have to show the developer that this is what's happening. And even sometimes when you show them what's happening, you got to get past that belief, that they have a problem they've got to fix. What's coming to my head is like this denial of service attack, and the attacker wasn't trying to take the site down. Right. What they were trying to do is they were trying to make links that would, from our website, that had a lot of value to marketers if we linked back to them.
Right.
And so they were putting their gambling sites and other kind of websites and stuff onto our, making it so it looked like our search engine was linking back to their sites, and it would make their sites, show up better on Google search or Google AdWords or whatever. And so they definitely weren't trying to shut down our website. But what was happening, because these URLs that they were putting in search were causing a query, and because the query wasn't in the cache, it went and did something in the backend database. And then the backend database was just getting flooded with these requests. and it would, crash the database, and then the whole site would go down, right? And it was really just, for me, it was really just, you're not really looking at the parameters. You're not looking at the, you're not looking at the inputs, and this is not a valid input, so you shouldn't be querying the database. And these were going like 30 queries a minute or something. It was not like a volumetric attack in any way. It wasn't fast, but it was just kept crashing this database. And I felt like, okay, so this attacker, he's trying to make his marketing better. He doesn't want to do this database thing, but it keeps crashing the database. And I kept having conversations with like, well, this is a cyber attack. Well, it is, but it really isn't. It's really a coding problem. You just have this vulnerable piece of code here that needs to be ramped up. And I think it took me 6 months to get those people to close it off. They just kept adding the number of connections that the query pool could use, and they were just stacking them up, and then finally they got it fixed. But it took a long time. And when you're helping the developers kind of get that mindset, are there any tricks or suggestions or recommendations that you've learned in doing this? Me as a CISO would make my relationship with developers easier and better.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's just understanding each other better, because I think in security, oftentimes developers look at us as a roadblock, right? And sometimes we are a huge roadblock, and sometimes we don't understand. We're not thinking of their deliverables as well, so we don't feel their pain. This is the CIS benchmark. This is what you have to do. And you're not understanding what they have to do, or depending on what industry they want to be first to market in something, and you're blocking them, right? And that's a problem. So I really think empathy is the most important thing. And that's kind of where my career trajectory has gone, right? I really wanted to be a hacker. That was really cool. But then I started talking to developers, and I started to understand more about where they're coming from and what their deliverables are and what their build pipeline is, and how my security requirements could delay them or hurt them from getting into production, and I become the bad guy. And it's like, okay, well, I'm going to understand where you're coming from, but I want you to understand where I'm coming from. And I think that's where it's really important. Instead of me showing you a CVSS score and saying, okay, this is a high vulnerability, if I can explain it to you in terms that this is a significant impact, if this goes to production, like you were just talking about, this could cause a denial of service, or an attacker could flood the database. So we need to build out more resiliency and make our code better now, because then we have tech down the line, and we're going to be paying for it down the line. So let's all save time on the front end. And I think that's why these buzzwords come out, right? Like, shifting left, or, the SDLC, or the secure software development lifecycle, is we're trying to build DevSecOps. We're trying to build security in from the very beginning, and we're trying to train developers from the very start about secure coding practices. And if we can get them in that mindset as early as possible, they become, we're allies now, we're not enemies.
Yeah, I agree. I think the earlier you identify gaps in the code, the less stressful it is for developers. Have I said no to code going into production many, many times? And a lot of the times it's just that the conversations that security need to have with the engineering teams didn't happen early enough. And they're hitting a deadline, and they're pushing to deliver a new feature that some executive wants into production. And that is a lot of pressure for developers and engineers and their leadership teams and everything else to not hit that target. And then having security take a look at the code at the very last minute, or look at the binaries that are being used and saying, hey, there's vulnerabilities here. And, and some of the effort that it would take for them to get everything kind of into the right versions that don't have vulnerabilities, it doesn't seem like a lot of effort to us on the cyber side, because we're not the ones doing it. But
right.
The further away that code is from, this version that has vulnerability to the version that doesn't, it could be several, minor versions of code that could have changed how their code that they've written to make work doesn't operate anymore, because some of the code's been deprecated, it's changed its behaviors. And now fixing all those problems becomes a 6-month journey, not a couple of days worth of journey, right? And I think that having empathy, I think, is great. But I think the conversations need to happen earlier, right? It's like, get involved earlier. I think security teams need to get involved earlier as well. Often security teams are surprised that, hey, there's something that needs to be released right now. And, what are they supposed to do? I mean, they have a job to protect the company as well, right? And so building that empathy, building those relationships, being involved with the business, so that like the CISO should be involved in the business conversations earlier. So making sure that that their teams understand the priority of different projects that are happening inside the business side, so that our architects and engineers can kind of engage earlier, so that we can make sure that the SDLC, the secure development lifecycle, is in place. How do we support it? Like you said, like, how do I get training to developers so that they can learn about secure coding practices in a friendly environment, not when their code's going to production. And then now this is when they're learning about secure coding practices and using parameters instead of just putting the whole SQL statement in the code. I think those things are building the relationships, making sure that y'all have beers together, lunch together, something, so that y'all have a relationship that's not built in an adversarial thing. Like, find your common. Y'all both like chess. Great. Y'all go play some chess together, whatever it is. Because I think that those are a lot to kind of building trust. Because I think there's a trust issue too, that developers don't trust cyber. Because again, a lot of times cyber has the CVSS and they say you have a vulnerability and they go fix it. And then now the security team has to become a researcher to figure out what it is that CVS, whatever is, or CVE, whatever it is. And what does the CVS score mean? And then how do they fix it? I think we put a lot of burden on the developers as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of it too, right? Is if I just drop a CVE on your lap and say, here, fix this, is there a problem? If you make it your problem too, or if you can do some research, right, on what the recommended mitigations are, or the patches, if you provide that to the developers and you work with them, because that's what's happening, I think, a lot now, or should, right, with internal pen testing teams or red teams, as well as with these bug bounty hunters, is retesting, right? They're building into the pipeline retesting. So, even in bug bounty programs where, okay, I found this vulnerability, awesome, can you retest it? And they get paid, right, for retesting the vulnerability, and it incentivizes the hacker, not bad, good hacker, to be invested in the entire life cycle, well, at least part of the life cycle, and help the developers fix the problem. So I think that's a big part of it too, is not just dropping the problem and running away. It's saying, okay, well, we're in this together again, right? From the beginning of our conversation, we're all on the blue team. We're all here to fix this because it affects all of us. So I think that mindset is what's going to pay dividends.
Agreed. I think that the world's changed a bit from as you and I have kind of had our careers for some time. I think the world's changed a bit. It used to be different, meaning that we had our own corporate data centers. We worked in private offices. Now everyone's working remotely, and we spend a lot more time in the browser today than we did before. And our applications from an enterprise side are like all over the place, right? They're, very distributed in nature. We don't have really like a controlled set of applications. I think there's a lot of custom apps being written, right, by developers, but a lot of them are being delivered on web browsers and such. And because we're kind of talking about the developer side and how they write code. On the client side, how they interact with applications, has that changed your syllabus and course materials at all? Like how do users use applications?
Absolutely. I mean, web browsers, I think, as you know, are a fascinating subject. I would remember in one of my jobs, I would triage these vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, and it would work. They say, okay, well, make sure you use this in Safari. And I would joke with my coworker and say, who uses Safari? Why don't people use Chrome? And then even in my courses, I would teach cross-frame scripting, which is something from Internet Explorer. This is something way back. And then you have to understand about same origin policy and why was Internet Explorer not respecting same origin policy? And then the implementation of CORS to kind of get around the same origin policy and what are the dangers with CORS and the misconfigurations that come with CORS vulnerabilities. And then you get into the fact that, most of the day we're on our phones. And okay, I click into WebView. Are there any vulnerabilities in WebView? I also worked for a company that was with a major social media platform that was all mobile based. And these are the things we had to think about there. So when you start thinking about mobile device management or bring your own device, everyone's viewing things in browsers, and then you think about agentic AI, right? That's everyone wants to talk about AI. So now I see AI reaching out via browser, and how are they doing that? Are they just making API calls? Are they using things like Selenium or Selenium? Some of this code that actually emulates a web browser or uses a web browser, and what vulnerabilities are we bringing back in that space? So I think there are many things to think about when it comes to, when we're thinking about using web browsers.
Yeah, I think what I worry about is things like OAuth consent, like, you sign in with your Google identity and you're sign into Google, and then it's this application's asking for a whole bunch of rights to your Google Drive and your email and everything else that you want and everything it wants, right? And now it has like a token that it can use to access your Google Drive and your Gmail and whatever your Google credentials and whatever you've allowed. And I think that there's a lot of ignorance in that space, or like what extensions you're using. You talked a little bit about browser AI agents that are using my identity. I have an AI agent that I want it to automate some of my work, kind of like, RPA, robotic process automation kind of stuff. But now I have a browser AI agent that has my identity that can just go off and do work on my behalf. And it's not a security trained professional, right? It's just this agent that wants to enthusiastically get the request done. And I think that this brings a lot of, potential avenues for hackers to take advantage of the users, as well as how is it that we're protecting that code on the other side? Kind of like with your open redirect, you set up a phishing site and you have an open redirect and how you can use those credentials to log in. And the user would never even know that they'd gone to a site that was being impersonated by a hacker. And then their experience continues on that website with their authenticated to. And they didn't really know that their credentials were stolen or anything. It's problematic from both a privacy perspective, your credentials. And then once you get someone's credentials, hopefully they're not reusing the password, which we know a lot of people reuse their passwords. Then they're just able to use that to get to more and more potentially private information that you didn't intend to have, right? So we worry a lot about law enforcement getting access to our privacy because they're putting in orders to say, hey, I want to get access to this. But then we don't know that there's hackers that are out there trying to steal our information as well. So I guess we do know that it's there, but I think that people think it's not happening or something.
Yeah, there was a marketplace, I think it was taken down, but it actually stole people's, I guess you could say, browser-based identity and allowed people to essentially emulate these victims and be able to log into their bank accounts. Hopefully there's defense in depth and there's, MFA. But this was a whole service. This was a whole, going back to dark market websites, this was a whole industry where you could essentially steal somebody's browser-based identity and have access to all the different sites. And, you're talking about OAuth and scopes and claims and things like that. And from a usability standpoint, it's much easier for me to click, the Google button when I'm registering for a website than it is for me to create a brand new account. There are certainly trade-offs with usability versus being secure, and which is better, right? Because if I do register for that site and I reuse a password, which is worse? Unfortunately, I think that's where it comes to with compensating controls in our industry, right? Is how can we know something's bad, how can we make it less bad? Is that side of the coin as well?
Absolutely. How do we do a better job protecting the user? We're not going to be able to keep up with training for users and enterprise IT users in particular on every kind of potential idea that hackers have in the world that we're going to be able to show them examples of and make their training complete, right? So a lot of times we just have to have the right kind of guardrails to protect our intellectual property, protect the user from phishing attacks, stop from business email compromises, OAuth consent phishing, using the wrong extensions in the browser. There's lots of things that we can put technical controls around that allow the user to have a safe experience and then interject when we have to, right? And we have technology that allows us to do it. I think that, there's definitely still a lot of ignorance about what it is that's being protected, on the endpoints and on your workstations. A lot of people think that EDR and antivirus are going to protect them, but a lot of attacks that happen just on the web, EDR and AV aren't going to help you with if it lands on your system, it'll help. If it's not on your system, it's still in the cloud, it's not really going to help. Well, let's talk about industry evolution and philosophy. From law enforcement to corporate security, you've seen the threat landscape evolve dramatically, I imagine, over the last 10 years or more. What was a particularly challenging threat you faced that shows how sophisticated modern cyber threats have become?
Sure. I mean, from the attacker perspective, right, you were talking about on-prem to begin with. And when I worked for the government, I wasn't in the cyber aspect or InfoSec, but a lot of legacy systems where if you attacked it, sure, you're in that government system. But now, at least in the past decade or so, right, we've migrated to the cloud, and the cloud became a whole different platform for attacks. And the introduction of instance metadata service and how that is not only attacking the web application, but potentially gaining access to other services, Lambda functions, S3. I'm very AWS centric in my mindset. But even ultimately, maybe you have access to the account, or you can do admin functions to, expand your attack surface. So that has really changed the landscape, I think, in the past decade or so, maybe more than that, but maybe more recently, is the fact that as companies are either hybrid or all in the cloud, that they really need to understand what the shared responsibility model is, and also what data they're putting in the cloud. There's too many times where I see an article saying an S3 bucket wasn't protected. Mm-hmm. And I think AWS has done a great job in, are you sure you want to make this public? Are you really sure you want to make this public? By default, this is not public. You shouldn't make this public. Type this in if you really want to make it public. Maybe that's part of it too, right? Someone just goes, this is the easiest thing is for me to allow public access to this bucket. But they don't realize it, or they forget about it, and they just leave it out there, and just bad cyber hygiene. So I think the cloud has helped in many, many ways, but it also kind of is a crutch in some ways, and misconfigurations can cause a whole lot of problems to be an understatement.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and even sometimes you maybe making it public was the right thing to do because of the use case that you had. However, I think that once you have it out there, the next thing that happens is you have another use case, and that use case, you shouldn't be putting confidential information into that bucket, but you already have the bucket and it's public, mm-hmm. right? And then mm-hmm. people just don't realize that they're taking confidential information. Now they're putting it in a public bucket. Even if they had initially a public bucket was okay use case, 18 months ago. But today I want to go put something private in. And I think that they just don't understand you need to look at this again when your use cases change. If you're doing something different, then make sure that all the security around it's also good too, right? Because I don't think it's completely ignorant. I mean, I think they probably do have a use case. I mean, I don't want to demonize developers. I think they have good reasons for making it public if they need to make it public. But at the same time, I think pressure, speed, not engaging the security teams early enough. Again, people don't like to do a lot of rework. They don't want to go back and look at a system again that they already looked at, and then they bring all their assumptions forward with that review. And people make mistakes. And we don't know. Even if you have a great security tool that's telling you that this is a public bucket, it doesn't matter because that security tool doesn't inspect the content. It's just telling you that this thing's bucket. It's not looking at the content saying this is confidential information that shouldn't be there. That might be a different solution that you need to have in place. But I think that definitely lots of opportunities with the cloud to make mistakes. I mean, just fast, furious kind of work that makes it hard to defend. One of the questions I have for you is around military grade security thinking and how do you make that practical for business applications? I mean, I think from my background, I did a lot of work with the U.S. Navy, maybe 11, 12 years, right? And going from commercial, working with the military, and then coming back to commercial, my mindset changed a lot. And I think one of the hard things for me going from military thinking to commercial was how to make it practical. Do you have any suggestions on how to translate military grade security strategies and thinking into practical business applications?
Ooh, tough question. Looking back at my military and law enforcement career, especially in the academy, what they kind of drilled into us was attention to detail. And I think really a lot of the topics we've touched on is attention to detail or a lack of attention to detail. And we talked about speed and moving to market, being the first mover to market, and the danger that bring. And I see so many SaaS applications being advertised now. There's a saying that we have in law enforcement: slow is smooth and smooth is fast, which I've never heard, I think, in corporate America, because, it really is let's move quickly. So it's let's move quickly, but let's be intentional about what we're doing. Let's really pay attention and use that attention to detail in what we're doing, because if we're not, there could be catastrophic consequences for not doing that, leaving that S3 bucket public. So I think if I could impress that into corporate America is, really have that attention to detail when you're trying to move fast. There is a balance there.
Agreed. And then finally, you're passionate about creating workspaces where people feel empowered, supported, and motivated. What's the story behind why you feel strongly about this?
Sure. I think it does go back to law enforcement and the military. And, essentially we're trained to work together. We're trained to work together, and that we're all a unit. And one person, although there may be officers or maybe you have a certain rank, if you're in a hostile situation or a deadly situation, anybody can call something out. Anyone can essentially be the boss if they have the best visibility into the situation that's going on and make the call. So, that's been somewhat of a challenge depending on the corporate environment I'm in, is really impressing that we're all in this together and we all need to work together. And I'm not saying that in the government I didn't experience, like you see on TV shows, where the different three-letter agencies are competing against each other for, recognition or budget or things like that. I think there's certainly that aspect. But those who have worked for me and with me know I'm a huge fan of the movie Groundhog Day. And my son, we just watched that the other day, and I asked him at the end of the movie, what's the lesson here? And that's what I ask people to do, is watch that movie and tell me what the lesson is. And ultimately, I had to kind of walk him through what the lesson was, but it's not when, Phil, the main character, is trying to get the girl. It's really when he goes out there and helps everybody that he ends up getting her in the end. Is really the goal is we all need to be good people and work together. And I think I see a lot of the time that, and it's just natural, right? People feel like they're not being appreciated, or, they want their piece of the pie. But what I've always said is the more you help others, you're going to look good because you're ultimately helping the team. So think of it not as I'm trying to outdo somebody, it's I'm trying to make everyone better. And the best leaders that I've seen are the ones that don't take credit for their team's success. They lift their people up, and people understand, hey, they have a good leader that has their back. And ultimately, that's what I try to emulate, is that, we're here to empower and support each other and not claim all the credit and glory for ourselves. It's idealistic, but I like to think it works.
No, I think it's a great message. I think that, we got to remember who the adversary is. The adversary is outside our organization that's trying to get into our organization and take advantage of us. As defenders, we need to just make sure that we recognize that we're all on the same team. We want what's best for the business, and we have adversaries that are trying to take advantage of us. How do we protect the business?
Right.
Clint, it was great meeting you today on the podcast. thanks for being here with me.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
And appreciate our conversation. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.